We call it Good Friday. A man was arrested in the middle of the night, betrayed by one of his close friends, beaten, mocked, nailed to a cross, and left to die in front of a crowd. And we call that good. Now, I get it. If you grew up in church, you probably heard this your whole life, and it just doesn't feel strange anymore. But I want you to stop for a second and sit with it because it should feel strange. Here's what I think happens. Most of us just rush past Good Friday in order to get to Easter because that's when we get to feast and when we get to feel happy, and that's completely natural. I get it. We treat Good Friday as if it's just a day we need to feel sad. It's an exercise in guilt, like we're just supposed to feel terrible for a day and then move on. But what if this misses the point entirely? Because to early Christians, this was one of the best days in history. Not one of the worst, one of the best. So today we're going to look at why that is. We're going to look back at scripture, see what actually happened on that Friday, what it means for us, and why one word Jesus spoke on the cross changes everything. Sound good? Get into it. The first thing I want us to understand is that the crucifixion wasn't a tragedy that God had to recover from. It was always the plan. I mean that quite literally. If we look back in the book of Isaiah, chapter 53, which was written 700 years before the crucifixion actually happened, we see the events of Good Friday were written down in detail, which should be a bit uncomfortable. So let's take a look at what it says. He was despised and rejected, a man of sorrows, acquainted with deepest grief. We turned our backs on him and looked the other way. He was despised and we did not care, yet it was our weaknesses he carried. It was our sorrows that weighed him down, and we thought his troubles were a punishment from God, a punishment for his own sins. But he was pierced for our rebellion, crushed for our transgressions. He was beaten so we could be whole. He was whipped so we could be healed. Here's what's important about the context of this chapter. Back in the time of Isaiah, the people were waiting for a Messiah, but they were waiting for a warrior king, a conqueror, someone to come in and crush their enemies. This passage was confusing to them. A suffering servant? Someone who was despised and rejected? It just didn't fit the picture that they had in their head. Then the crucifixion happened, and they started to put two and two together. The early church read Isaiah 53, and it started to make sense. They started to see that this wasn't God's plan B. This is what he had been planning for centuries. Now, if we fast forward to the cross itself, in Mark chapter 15, verse 34, we see Jesus crying out, my God, why have you abandoned me?" If you know your Psalms really well, you'll recognize that line. It's the opening to Psalm 22. Jesus isn't just expressing his anguish here, which he is doing, but he's quoting scripture as a fulfillment of his own prophecy in a way that the people there would have noticed. This moment has such gravity. There's a song by Carrie Job called Forever that says, his blood poured out for us, the weight of every curse upon him. One final breath he gave as heaven looked away. The Son of God was laid in darkness. When heaven looked away is a line that really hits me. I mean, Jesus is a part of the Trinity, one of the communal parts of God. But at this time, he was being crushed for our sin. I think when heaven looked away is a good metaphor, but I think what actually happened is that God looked right at him, but in a very different way. All of the justice had to be done for the sins that we did. So heaven didn't look away from Jesus. The love of the Father did. But then the wrath of the Father looked right at him. I digress from that point, though. If we go back to our verse in Psalms, we see that Jesus is not a victim in this scenario. It helps support it. He knows exactly what is happening to him, and he chooses to quote this in Scripture. And this brings us to the Garden of Gethsemane in Luke 22. Jesus is on his knees, sweating drops of blood, and he is praying this: Father, if you are willing, please take this cup of suffering away from me. Yet I want your will to be done, not mine. Jesus asked for another way. He was fully divine, but he was also fully man. He was feeling the fear in that moment just the way that we would. He asked for another way, but there wasn't one, and he went anyway. And then in John 10:18, we see more support for this, where Jesus says this about his own life: no one can take my life from me. I sacrifice it voluntarily. Jesus chose this. And I want you to hold on to the question of why, because we're going to come back to it more later too. Now, here's where this gets really personal, and I mean that. John Stott, a respected theologian of the 20th century, wrote this sentence about the crucifixion, and I think it's something we really need to reflect on more and more. Before we can begin to see the cross as something done for us, we have to see it as something done by us. Let's read that again. Before we see it as something done for us, we need to see it as something done by us. Jesus told parables constantly, and in each one he invites you to find yourself in the story, to identify with one of the characters, to really learn what it's trying to say. So where are we in this story? Because I don't think we're the disciples watching at a distance. We're not Pontius Pilate washing our hands of it to avoid responsibility. I think in the deepest theological sense, we are the reason that this terrible event happened to Jesus. I know that's uncomfortable, but stay with me because this isn't meant to crush you. It's supposed to show you the weight of what Jesus did. There was a situation that we couldn't fix on our own, and he stepped in for us. In Romans 3:23, we see, "For all have sinned and fall short of God's glorious standards." And in Hebrews 10:4, we see, "It is not possible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins." Now, that whole chapter in Hebrews actually details what went on here really well. So I challenge you to go and read that. The entire sacrificial system of the Old Testament, every lamb, every altar, every day of atonement, it was God saying something is going to come in the future that is going to actually finish this. Every sacrifice was pointing towards something that could finally pay the debt, a debt that was very real and one that we could not pay ourselves. If any of this is resonating with you, please hit that like button. It helps me know that you want to see more content like this. So, what actually happened on the cross? Well, Fleming Rutledge, a theologian who has written what many consider to be the premier book on the crucifixion, it's called The Crucifixion, makes a point that I keep coming back to. God didn't send a memo, he didn't send a representative. He actually came down into the worst of it, into the shame, into the suffering, and into the abandonment, which means there is no human suffering outside of his reach. Whatever you are carrying, he has been there. Matthew 27:45 says, "At noon, darkness fell across the whole land until 3 o'clock." Darkness in the middle of the day for 3 hours. I mean, that's strange, and it's not just atmosphere. This is something that actually happened and was predicted in Amos chapter 8, verse 9, where it says this: "In that day I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth while it is still day." This was creation mourning its own creator. I mean, what a day it must have been. Some folks say it probably had to be a solar eclipse, but I mean, those only last for a few minutes, right? This was 3 hours of darkness in the middle of the day. It was completely unprecedented. And then in Matthew 27:51, when Jesus takes his last breath, it says, "At that moment, the curtain in the sanctuary of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom." It tore top to bottom, and that was God's doing, not man's. You need to understand what this curtain was. It was what separated the Holy of Holies, the most sacred place in the temple where God's literal presence dwelt, separated it from everyone else. And only one person was allowed to go in there one time per year after extensive ritual purification. That curtain tore, and it was a big curtain. It wasn't something you could just take and rip down the middle. The room was open, and that symbology was monumental. Access to God was no longer restricted to one man once per year. The old system was finished. Through Christ, we all have access to the Father all the time. That is huge. And then John 19:30, Jesus' final words before he dies are, "It is finished." In Greek, that's one word, Tetelestai. And here's why that word matters so much. In the ancient world, when a debt was paid in full, when you owed someone money and you settled that account, the creditor would stamp the certificate with one word, Tetelestai, paid in full. Jesus didn't say, "I am finished." He said, "The work is finished." The debt that we couldn't pay year over year with animal sacrifices, with any amount of praying or apology, canceled, stamped, done. Brennan Manning, who wrote a book called The Ragamuffin Gospel, says that this wasn't about making us nicer people. It wasn't just a moral upgrade. This was transformation at the deepest level, brand new creation. The cross had to happen because nothing less could do what needed to be done to reconnect us to God. 2 Corinthians 5:21 captures this perfectly. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. That was the great exchange, the one that had to happen. He who deserved no punishment because he had no sin took all of the punishment we deserve, and instead we received his unabated connection to the Father, a personal relationship with God. Each of these things about the cross has such gravity, and we need to think about that. And I would love to ask you, what's one thing about the cross that you've glossed over? Maybe because you've heard it so many times, or just because you haven't sat with it deeply to reflect on it. I want you to comment down below so we can continue this conversation. I genuinely want to hear what you have to say. So we come back to the question I asked earlier. He chose this, but why? Gethsemane shows us he didn't want to suffer. He wasn't indifferent to the pain. I mean, he was fully human. He felt what was coming and he was afraid. But he went anyway, not out of obligation, not because he had no choice. I mean, he said it himself that no one takes his life from him. He gives it voluntarily. So why? Augustine, one of the greatest theologians in history, says that the cross is the chair from which Christ taught his greatest lesson. And the lesson is simply this: the extent of God's love. The cross is not a feeling, it's not a sentiment, it's not a theological concept, it is an event, a fact nailed in history. So that when you ask, how much does God love me? Your answer is Good Friday. Not just a word, an event. Something real you can point to that says that much. He took every punishment he didn't deserve on himself because he wanted you back. He wanted your connection to God to be restored so that you could live fully and free. Before we close, I want to say something that I think does matter. Good Friday does give us permission to grieve. Just because we see why Christ did this doesn't mean it's all puppies and rainbows. You know, grief happens, and there's not always goodness attached to it immediately. There's not always a silver lining that you can cling to right away. The disciples didn't know that Sunday was coming. They sat for the rest of Friday and Saturday, beginning of Sunday. They sat in silence, in confusion, in watching the person that they loved, the one who they thought was the Messiah, die in shame on a cross. And that is the real human experience. And it's okay to be in that place of grief. Something Queen Elizabeth II said rings true here. Grief is the price that we pay for love. The only way to never grieve is to have never loved in the first place. And as much as grief sucks, that is just too high a price. But here's what we have that the disciples didn't have. We get to read the story until it ends. The darkness, the silence, the sealed tomb, none of it was the end. The Tetelestai was spoken on Friday. The debt was paid, but the story wasn't over. And that's what we're going to pick up next week. Thank you all so much for staying with me to the end of the video. It means the world to me. If you like the video, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the Easter video, because you're not going to want to miss it, all right? If something stirred in you while you were watching this, please drop it in the comments down below. I would love to keep the conversation going. I'll see you next week. I love you all. Peace.